Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis. This is episode 5 of The Open Conspiracy by H.G. Wells, chapter 15. Early constructive work of the open conspiracy. In such terms, we may sketch the practicable and possible opening phase of the open conspiracy. We do not present it as a movement initiated by any individual or radiating from any particular center. In this book, we are not starting something. We are describing and participating in something which has started. It arises naturally and necessarily from the present increase of knowledge and the broadening outlook of many minds throughout the world, and gradually becomes conscious of itself. It is reasonable, therefore, to anticipate its appearance all over the world in sporadic, mutually independent groupings and movements, and to recognize not only that they will be extremely various, but that many of them will trail with them racial and religious habits and characteristics which will only be shaken off as its cosmopolitan character becomes imperatively evident. The passage from the partial anticipations of the open conspiracy that already abound everywhere to its complete and completely self-conscious statement may be made by almost imperceptible degrees. Today it may seem no more than a visionary idea. Tomorrow it may be realized as a worldwide force of opinion and will. People will pass with no great inconsistency from saying that the conspiracy is impossible to saying that it has always been the plain and clear to them. To this fashion they have shaped their lives as long as they can remember. In its opening phase in the day of small things, quite minor accidents may help or delay the clear definition and popularization of its main ideas. The changing pattern of the public events may disperse or concentrate action upon it, or it may win the early adherence of men of exceptional resources, energy, or ability. It is impossible to foretell the speed of its advance. Its development may be slower or faster, direct or devious, but the logic of accumulating realizations thrusts it forward, will persist in thrusting it on, and sooner or later will be discovered, conscious and potent, the working religion of most sane and energetic people. Meanwhile, our supreme virtues must be faith and persistence. So far, we have considered only two of the main activities of the open conspiracy. The one being its propaganda of convenience in the possible world commonweal, and the other its immediate practical attempt to systematize resistance to militant and competitive imperialism and nationalism. But such things are merely its groundwork undertakings. They do no more than clear the site and make the atmosphere possible for its organized constructive efforts. Directly we turn to questions of special knowledge, special effort, and special organization. Let us consider first the general advancement of science, the protection and support of scientific research, and the diffusion of scientific knowledge. These things fall within the normal scheme of duty for the members of the open conspiracy. The world of science and experiment is the regional origin of nearly all the great initiatives that characterize our times. The open conspiracy owes its inspiration, its existence, its form and direction entirely to the changes of conditions these initiatives have brought about. And yet a large number of scientific workers live outside the sphere of sympathy in which we may expect the open conspiracy to materialize, and collectively their political and social influence upon the community is extraordinarily small. Having regard to the immensity of its contributions and the incapable value of its promise to the modern community, science research, that is, and the diffusion of scientific knowledge is extraordinarily neglected, starved, and threatened by hostile interference. This is largely because scientific work has no strong unifying organization and cannot in itself develop such an organization. Science is a hard mistress, and the first condition of the successful scientific work is that the scientific man should stick to his research. The world of science is therefore in itself, at its core, a miscellany of specialists, often very ungracious specialists, and rather than offer him help and cooperation, it calls for understanding, tolerance, service from the men of general intelligence and wider purpose. The company of scientific man is less like a host of guiding angels than like a swarm of marvelous bees endowed with stings, which must be hived and cherished and multiplied by the open conspiracy. But so soon as we have the open conspiracy at work, putting its plan and offering its developing ideas and activities to the most precociously preoccupied men, then reasonably, when it involves no special trouble for them, when it is the line of least resistance for them, they may be expected to fall in with its convenient and helpful aims and find in it what they have hitherto lacked, a common system of political and social concepts to hold them together. When that stage is reached, we shall be saved such spectacles of intellectual prostitution as the last great war offered, when men of science were herded, blinking from their laboratories to curse one another upon nationalist lines, and when after the war, stupid and wicked barriers were set up to the free communication of knowledge by the exclusion of the scientific men of this or that nationality from international scientific gatherings. The open conspiracy must help the men of science to realize at present, he fails most astonishingly to realize, that he belongs to a greater comity than any king or president responds to today, and so prepare him for better behavior in the next season of trial. The formation of groups in and not only in, but about and in relation to the scientific world, which will add to the first main activities of the open conspiracy, propaganda, and pacifism, a special attention to the needs of scientific work may be enlarged upon with advantage here, because it will illustrate quite typically the idea of a special work carried out in relation to a general activity, which is the subject of this session. The open conspiracy extends its innovation to all sorts and conditions of men, but the service of scientific progress is for those only who are specifically equipped or who are sufficiently interested to equip themselves. For scientific work, there is first and of all a great need of endowment and the setting up of laboratories, observatories, experimental stations, and the like in all parts of the world. Numbers of men and women capable of scientific work never achieve it for want of the stimulus of opportunity afforded by endowment. Few contrive to create their own opportunities. The essential man of science is very rarely an able collector of administrator of money, and anyhow, the detailed work of organization is a grave call upon a special mental energy. But many men capable of a broad and intelligent appreciation of scientific work, but not capable of the peculiar intensities of research, have the gift of extracting money from private and public sources. And it is for them to use the gift modestly and generously in providing the framework for those more especially endowed. There is already a steadily increasing need for the proper storage and indexing of scientific results, and every fresh worker enhances it. Quite a considerable amount of scientific work goes fruitless or is needlessly repeated because of the growing volume of publication, and men make discoveries in the field of reality only to lose them again in the lumber room of record. Here is a second line of activity to which the open conspirator with scientific bias may direct his attention. A third line is the liaison work between the men of science and the common intelligent man. The promotion of publications which will either state the substance, implications, and consequences of new work in the vulgar tone, or, if that is impossible, train the general run of people to the new idioms and technicalities which need to be incorporated with the vulgar tongue, if it is still to serve its ends as a means of intellectual intercourse. Throughout special ad hoc organizations, societies for the promotion of research, for research defense, for world indexing, for the translation of scientific papers, for the diffusion of new knowledge, the surplus emergencies of a great number of open conspirators can be directed to entirely creative ends. In the New World system of scientific work built up, within which such dear old institutions as the Royal Society of London, the various European academies of science, and the like, now overgrown and inadequate, can maintain their venerable pride in themselves, their mellowing prestige and their distinguished exclusiveness, without the present privilege of inflicting cramping slights and restrictions upon the more abundant scientific activities of today. So in relation to science, and here the word is being used in its narrower accepted meaning for what is often spoken of as pure science, the search for physical and biological realities, uncomplicated by moral, social, and practical considerations, we evoke a conception of the open conspiracy as producing groups of socially associated individuals who engage primarily in the general basic activities of the conspiracy and adhere to and promote the 7 broad principles summarized at the end of chapter 14, but who work also with the larger part of their energies. Through international and cosmopolitan societies, and in a multitude of special ways for the establishment of an enduring and progressive world organization of pure research. They will have come to this special work because their distinctive gifts, their inclinations, their positions, and opportunities have indicated it as theirs. Now, a very parallel system of open conspiracy groups is conceivable in relation to business and industrial life. It would necessarily be a vastly bulkier and more heterogeneous system of groups, but otherwise the analogy is complete. Here we imagine those people whose gifts, inclinations, positions, and opportunities as directors, workers, or associates give them an exceptional insight into and influence in the processes of producing and distributing commodities, can also be drawn together into groups within the open conspiracy. But these groups will be concerned with the huge and more complicated problems of the processes, by which even now the small, isolated individual adventures in production and trading that constitute the economic life of former civilizations are giving place to larger, better instructed, better planned industrial organizations, whose operations and combinations become at last worldwide. The amalgamations and combinations, the substitution of large-scale businesses for multitudes of small-scale businesses, which are going on now, go on with all the cruelty and disregards of a natural process. If a man is to profit and survive, these unconscious blunderings, which now stagger towards, but which may never attain world organization, must be watched, controlled, mastered, and directed. As uncertainty diminishes, the quality of adventure and the amount of waste diminish also, and large speculative profits are no longer possible or justifiable. The transition from speculative adventure to organized foresight is in the common interest in the whole world of economic life. This is the substantial task of the open conspiracy, and is these specifically interested in equipped groups and not the movement as a whole, which may best begin to attack upon these fundamental readjustments. The various socialist movements of the 19th and earlier 20th centuries had this in common. They sought to replace the private owner in most or all economic interests by some vaguely apprehended public owner. This, following the democratic disposition of the times, was commonly conceived of as an elected body, a municipality, the parliamentary state, or whatnot. There were municipal socialists, nationalizing socialists, imperial socialists. In the mystic teachings of Marx, the collective power owner was to be the dictatorship of the proletariat. Production for profit was denounced. The contemporary mind realizes the evils of production for profit and of the indiscriminate scrambling of private ownership more fully than ever before, but it has a completer realization and a certain accumulation of experience in the difficulties of organizing that larger ownership we desire. Private ownership may not be altogether evil as a provisional stage, even if it has no more in its favor than the ability to transcend political boundaries. Moreover, and here again, the democratic prepossessions of the 19th century come in, the socialist movements sought to make every single adherent a reformer and a propagandist of economic methods. In order to do so, it was necessary to simplify economic processes to the crudity of nursery toys and the intricate interplay of will and desire and enterprise, normal development, and direction. In questions of ownership, wages, credit, and money was reduced to a childish fable of surplus value wickedly appropriated. The open conspiracy is not so much a socialism as a more comprehensive offspring which has eaten and assimilated whatever was digestible of its socialist forebears. It turns to biology for guidance towards the regulation of quantity and a controlled distribution of the human population of the world, and it judges all the subsidiary aspects of property and pay by the criterion of most efficient production and distribution in relation to the indications thus obtained. These economic groups, then, of the open conspiracy, which may come indeed to be a large part of the open conspiracy, will be working in that vast task of economic reconstruction, which from the point of view of the older socialism was the sole task before mankind. They will be conducting experiments and observing processes according to their opportunities. Through ad hoc societies and journals, they will be comparing and examining their methods and preparing reports and clear information for the movement at large. The whole question of money and monetary methods in our modern communities is so extraordinarily disregarded in socialist literature will be examined under the assumption that money is the token of the community's obligation, direct or indirect, to an individual, and credit its permission to deal freely with material. The whole psychology of industry and industrial relationship needs to be revised and restated in terms of the collective efficiency and welfare of mankind. And just as far as it can be contrived, the counsel and the confidences of those who now direct great industrial and financial operations will be involved. The first special task of a banker, or a bank clerk for that matter, who joins the open conspiracy, will be to answer the questions: what is a bank? What are you going to do about it? What have we to do about it? The first questions to a manufacturer will be: what are you making and why? And what are you and when and we to do about it? Instead of the crude proposals to expropriate and take over by the state of the primitive socialism, the open conspiracy will build up an encyclopedic conception of the modern economic complex as labyrinthine pseudo-system progressively eliminating waste and working its way along the multitudinous channels towards unity, towards clarity of purpose and method, towards abundant productivity and efficient social service. Let us come back now for a paragraph or so to the ordinary adherent to the open conspiracy. The adherent considered not in relation to his special aptitudes and services, but in relation to the movement as a whole and to the special constructive organizations outside his own field. It will be his duty to keep his mind in touch with the progressing concepts of the scientific work, so far as he is able, and with the larger issues of the economic reconstruction that is afoot, to take his cues from special groups and organizations engaged upon that work, and to help where he finds his opportunity and where there is a call upon him. But no adherent to the open conspiracy can remain merely and completely an ordinary adherent. There can be no pawns in the game of the open conspiracy, no cannon fodder in its war. A special activity, quite as much as a general understanding, is demanded from everyone who looks creatively towards the future of mankind. We have instanced first the fine and distinctive world organization of pure science, and then the huge, massive movement towards cooperating unity of aim in the economic life, until at last the production and distribution of staple necessities is apprehended as one world business. And we have suggested that this latter movement may gradually pervade and incorporate a very great bulk of human activities. But besides this fine current and this great torrent of evolving activities and relationships, there are also a very considerable variety of other great functions in the community towards which the open conspiracy groups must direct their organizing inquiries and suggestions in their common intention of ultimately assimilating all the confused processes of today into a world community. For example, there must be a series of groups in close touch at one end with the biological sciences and at one end with the complex economic activity. Who will be considered specially with the practical administration of the biological interests of the race, from food plants and industrial products to pestilences and population. And other series of groups will gather together attention and energy to focus them upon the educational process. We have already pointed out that there is a strong disposition towards conservatism in normal educational institutions. They preserve traditions rather than develop them. They are likely to set up a considerable resistance to the reconstruction of the world outlook upon threefold basis defined in Chapter 14. This resistance must be attacked by special societies, by the establishment of competing schools, by help and promotion for enlightened teachers, and wherever the attack is incompletely successful, it must be supplemented by the energetic diffusion of educational literature for adults upon modern lines. The forces of the entire movement may be mobilized in a variety of ways to bring pressure upon reactionary schools and institutions. A set of activities correlated with most of the directly creative ones will lie through existing political and administrative bodies. The political work of the open conspiracy must be conducted upon two levels, and by entirely different methods. Its main political idea, its political strategy, is to weaken, efface, incorporate, or supersede existing governments. But there is also a tactical diversion of administrative powers and resources to economic and educational arrangements of a modern type. Because a country or a district is inconvenient as a division and destined to ultimate absorption in some more comprehensive and economic system of government, that is no reason why its administration should not be brought, meanwhile, into working cooperation with the development of the open conspiracy. Free trade nationalism in power is better than high tariff nationalism, and pacifist party liberalism better than aggressive party patriotism. This evokes the anticipation of another series of groups, a group in every possible political division, whose task it will be to organize the whole strength of the open conspiracy in that division as an effective voting or agitating force. In many divisions, this might soon become a sufficiently considerable bloc to affect the attitudes and pledges of the national politicians. The organizations of these political groups into provincial or national conferences and systems would follow hard upon their appearance. In their program, they would be guided by meetings and discussions with the specifically economic, educational, biological, scientific, and cultural groups. But they would also form their own special research bodies to work out the incessant problems of transition between the old type of locally centered administration and the developing world system of political controls. In the preceding chapter, we sketched the first practicable first phase of the open conspiracy as the propaganda of a group of interlocking ideas, a propaganda associated with a pacifist action. In the present chapter, we have given a scheme of branching and amplifying development. In this scheme, the scheme of the second phase, we conceive of the open conspiracy as consisting of a great multitude and variety of overlapping groups, but now all organized for collective political, social, and educational as well as propagandist action. They will recognize each other much more clearly than they did at first, and they will have acquired a common name. The groups, however, almost all of them will still have specific work also. Some will be organizing a sounder setting for scientific progress, some exploring new social and educational possibilities, many concentrate upon this or that phase in the reorganization of the world's economic life, and so forth. The individual open conspirator may belong to one or more groups, and in addition to the ad hoc societies and organizations which the movement will sustain, often in cooperation with partially sympathetic people still outside its ranks. The chapter of the open conspiracy will now be plainly displayed. It will have become a great world movement as a widespread and evident as socialism or communism. It will have taken the place of these movements very largely. It will be more than they were. It will be, frankly, a world religion. This large, loose, assimilatory mass of movements, groups, and societies will be definitely and obviously intending to swallow up the entire population of the world and become the new human community. Chapter 16, existing and developing movements which are contributory to the open conspiracy and which must develop a common consciousness, the parable of Provender Island. A suggestion has already been made in an earlier chapter of this essay, which may perhaps be expanded here a little more. It is that there already exists in the world a considerable number of movements in industry, political life, in social matters, and education, which point in the same direction as the open conspiracy and are inspired by the same spirit. It will be interesting to discuss how far some of these movements may not become confluent with others, and by a mere process of logical completion identify themselves consciously with the open conspiracy in its entirety. Consider, for example, the movement for a scientific study and control of population pressure, known popularly as the birth control movement. By itself, assuming existing political and economic conditions, this movement lays itself open to the charge of being no better than a scheme of race suicide. If a population in some area of high civilization attempts to restrict increase, organizes economic life upon methods of maximum individual productivity, and impose order and beauty upon its entire territory, that region will become irresistibly attractive to any adjacent festering mass of low-grade, highly reproductive population. The cheap humanity of the one community will make a constant attack upon the other affording facile servility, prostitutes, toilers, hand labor. Tariffs against Soviet products, restriction of immigration, tensions leading at last to a war of a defensive massacre are inevitable. The consequence of an illiterate, hungry, and incontinent multitude may be almost as disastrous as a defeat for the selector race. Indeed, one finds that in the discussion of the propagandists of the birth control admit that their project must be universal or dysgenic. But yet quite a number of them do not follow up these admissions to their logical consequences, produce the lines and continue the curves until the complete form of the open conspiracy appears. It will be the business of the open conspiracy propagandists to make them do so and to install groups and representatives at every possible point of advantage in this movement. And similarly, the now very numerous associations for world peace halt in alarm on the edge of their own implications. World peace remains a vast aspiration until there is some substitute for the present competition of states for markets and raw materials, and some restraint upon population pressure. League of Nations societies and all forms of pacifistic organization are either futile or insincere until they come into line with the complementary propositions of the open conspiracy. The various socialist movements, again, are a partial object, professing at present to be self-sufficient schemes. Most of them involve a pretense that national and political forces are intangible phantoms, and that the primary issue of population pressure can be ignored. They produce one woolly schema after another for transferring the property in this, that, or the other economic plant, and interest from bodies of shareholders and company promoters to gangs of politicians or syndicates of workers to be steered to efficiency. It would seem by pillars of cloud by day and pillars of fire by night. The Communist Party has trained a whole generation of disciples to believe that the overthrow of vaguely apprehended capitalism is the simple solution of all human difficulties. No movement ever succeeded so completely in substituting phrases for thought. And Moscow communism has trampled capitalism underfoot for 10 eventful years and still finds all the problems of social and political construction before it. But as soon as the socialist or communist can be got to realize that his repudiation of private monopolization is not a complete program, but just a preliminary principle, he is ripe for the ampler concepts of the modern outlook. The open conspiracy is the natural inheritor of the socialist and communist enthusiasms. It may be in control of Moscow before it is in control of New York. The open conspiracy may achieve the more or less complete amalgamation of all the radical impulses in the Atlantic community of today, but its scope is not confined to the variety of sympathetic movements which are brought to mind by that loose word radical. In the past 50 years or so, while socialists and communists have been denounced in the current processes of economic life in the same invariable phrases and with the same undiscriminating animosity, these processes have been undergoing the profoundest and most interesting changes. While socialist thought has recited its phrases with their witty rather than the substantive variations 1,000 times, as many clever people have been busy upon industrial, mercantile, and financial processes, the socialist still reiterates that this great body of world intelligence has been seeking private gain, which has just as much truth in it as is necessary to make it an intoxicating lie. Everywhere competitive businesses have been giving way to amalgamated enterprises, marching towards monopoly, and personally owned businesses to organizations so large as to acquire more and more the character of a publicly responsible bodies. In theory, in Great Britain, banks are privately owned and railway transport is privately owned, and they are run entirely for profit. In practice, their profit making is astutely restrained, and their proceedings are all the more sensitive to public welfare because they are outside the direct control of party politicians. Now, this transformation of business, trading, and finance has been so multitudinous and so rapid as to be still largely unconscious of itself. Intelligent men have gone from combination to combination and extended their range year by year without realizing how their activities were enlarging them to conspicuousness and responsibility. Economic organization is even now only discovering itself for what it is. It has accepted incompatible existing institutions to its own great injury. It has been patriotic and broken its shins against the tariff walls its patriotism has raised to hamper its own movements, and has been imperial and found itself taxed to the limits of endurance, controlled by antiquated military and naval experts, and crippled altogether. The younger and more vigorous intelligences in the great business directorates of today are beginning to realize the uncompleted implications of their enterprise. A day will come when the gentlemen who are trying to control the oil supplies of the world without reference to anything else except as a subsidiary factor in their game will be considered to be quaint characters. The end of the big business must carry big business in its open conspiracy just as surely as every other creative and broadly organized movement is carried. Now I know that to all this urging towards a unification of constructive effort, a great number of people will be disposed to reply, which will, I hope, be less popular in the future than it is at the present time. They will assume first an expression of great sagacity, an elderly air. Then, smiling gently, they will ask whether there is not something preposterously ambitious in looking at the problem of life as one whole. Is it not wiser to concentrate our forces on more practicable things, to attempt one thing at a time, not to antagonize the whole order of established things against our poor desires, to begin tentatively to refrain from putting too great a strain upon people, to trust to the growing common sense of the world to adjust this or that line of progress to the general scheme of things? Far better accomplish something definite here and there than challenge a general failure. That is, they declare how reformers and creative things have gone on in the past. That is how they are going on now, muddling forward in a mild and confused and partially successful way. Why not trust them to go on like that? Let each man do his bit with a complete disregard of the logical interlocking of progressive effort to which I have been drawing attention. Now, I must confess that, popular as the style of argument is, it gives me so tedious a feeling that rather than argue against it in general terms, I will resort to a parable. I will relate to the story of the pig on Provender Island. There was, you must understand, only one pig on Provender Island, and heaven knows how it got there. Whether it escaped and swam ashore, or was put ashore from some vessel suddenly converted to vegetarianism, I cannot imagine. At first, it was the only mammal there, but later on, 3 sailors and a very small but observant cabin boy were wrecked there. And after subsisting for a time on shellfish and roots, they became aware of the pig. And simultaneously, they became aware of a nearly intolerable craving for bacon. The eldest of the 3 sailors began to think of ham he had met in his boyhood, a beautiful ham of which his father had had the carving knife specially sharpened. The second of the 3 sailors dreamed repeatedly of a roast loin of pork he had eaten at his sister's wedding, and the third's mind ran on chitterlings. I know not why they sat about the meager fire and conferred and expatiated upon these things until their mouths watered and the shellfish turned to water within them. What dreams came to the cabin boy are unknown, for it was their custom to discourage his confidences. But as he sat apart brooding and was at last moved to speech, let us hunt that old pig, he said, and kill it. Now, it may have been because it was the habit of the sailors to discourage the cabin boy and keep him in his place, but anyhow, for whatever reason, it was all 3 sailors with one accord to oppose the proposal. Who spoke of killing the pig, said the eldest sailor loudly, looking around to see if there's any chance the pig was within hearing. Who spoke of killing the pig? You're the sort of silly young devil who jumps at ideas and has no sense of difficulties. What I said was I am. All I want is just an am to which with my roots in sea salt. One am, the left am. I don't want the right one, and I don't propose to get it. I've got a sense of proportion and a proper share of humor, and I know my limitations. I'm a sound, clear-headed, practical man. Am is what I'm after, and if I can't get that, and I'm prepared to stay quits and let the rest of the pig alone. Who's for joining me and let left am unt, a simple, responsible left am unt, just to get one left am? Nobody answered him directly, but when his voice died away, the next sailor, in order of seniority, took up the tale. That boy, he said, will die for the swelled Ed, and I pity him. My idea is to follow up the pig and get a hold of him by a loin chop. Just simply a loin chop. A loin chop is good enough for me. It's feasible, much more feasible than a great am. Here we are. We've got no gun. We've got no wood of sort to make bows and arrows. We've got nothing but our clasp knives, and the pig can run like hell. It's ridiculous to think of killing that pig. But if one didn't trouble him, if one kind of it got into the confidence and crept near him, and just quietly and insidiously went after his loin, just sort of as if one was tickling him, one might get a loin chop almost before he knew it. The third sailor sat crumpled up and downcast with his lean fingers tangled in the shock of his hair. Chitterlings, he murmured, chitterlings. I don't even want to think of the pig. And the cabin boy pursued his ideas in silence, for he deemed it unwise to provoke his elders further. On these lines, it was the three sailors set about gratifying for their taste of pork, each in his own way, separately, insanely, and modestly, and each had his reward. The first sailor, after weeks of patience, got within an arm's length of the pig, and smacked that covered left dam loud and good, and felt success was near. The other two heard the smack and the grunt and of dismay half a mile away, but the pig, in a state of astonishment, carried the ham off out of reach. There and then, and that was as close as the first sailor ever got to his first objective. The roast loin hunter did no better. He came upon the pig asleep under a rock one day and jumped upon the very loin he desired, but the pig bit him deeply and septically better. He came upon the pig septically and displayed so much resentment that the question of the chop was dropped forthwith and never again broached between them. And thereafter, the arm of the second sailor was bandaged and swelled and went from bad to worse. And so for the third sailor, it is doubtful whether he even got wind of the chitterling from the start to the finish of this parable. The cabin boy, pursuing notions of his own, made a pitfall for the whole pig. But as the others did not help him, and he was an excessively small, though shrewd cabin boy, it was a feeble and insufficient pit, and all it caught was the hunter of the chitterlings, who was wandering distraught. After which the hunter of the chitterlings became a hunter of cabin boys, and the cabin boy's life, for all his shrewdness, was precarious and unpleasant. But he slept only in snatches and learned the full bitterness of insight misunderstood. When at last the ship came to Provender Island and took off the three men and the cabin boy, the pig was still baking intact and quite gay and cheerful, and all the four castaways were in a very emaciated condition because at that season of the year shellfish were rare and edible roots were hard to find, and the pig was very much cleverer than they were in finding them and digging them up, let alone digesting them. From which parable it may be gathered that a partial enterprise is not always wiser or more hopeful than a comprehensive one. And in the same manner, with myself in the role of that minute but observant cabin boy, I would sustain the proposition that none of these movements of partial reconstruction has the sound common sense quality its supporters suppose. All these movements are worthwhile if they can be taken into worldwide movement. All in isolation are futile. They will be overlaid and lost in the general drift. The policy of the whole hog is the best one and the sanest one, the easiest and the most hopeful. If sufficient men and women of intelligence can realize that simple truth and give up their lives to it, mankind may yet achieve a civilization and power and fullness of life beyond our present dreams. If they do not, frustration will triumph in war, violence, and driveling waste of time and strength, and desire more disgusting even than war will be the lot of our race down through the ages to its emaciated and miserable end. For this little planet of ours is quite off the course of any rescue ships, if the will in our species fails. We can do this one. Chapter 17, the creative home, social group, and school, the present waste of idealistic will. Human society began with the family. The natural history of variousness is a history of the establishment of mutual toleration among human animals, so that a litter or a herd keeps together instead of breaking up. It is in the family group that the restraints, disciplines, and self-sacrifices which make human society possible were worked out, and our fundamental prejudices established. And it is in the family group, enlarged perhaps in many respects, and more responsive to collective society, social influences, that our social life must be relearned generation after generation. Now, in each generation, the open conspiracy, until it can develop its own reproductive methods, must remain a minority movement of intelligent converts. A unified progressive world community demands its own type of home and training. It needs to have its fundamental concepts firmly established in as many minds as possible and to guard its children from the infection of the old racial and national hatreds and jealousies, old superstitions and bad mental habits, and base interpretations of life. From its onset, the open conspiracy will be setting itself to influence the existing educational machinery, but for a long time it will find itself confronted in school and college by powerful religious and political authorities determined to set back the children to the point or even behind the point from which their parents made their escape. At best, the liberalism of the state-controlled schools will be a compromise. Originally, schools and colleges were transmitters of tradition and conservative forces, so they remain in essence to this day. Organized teaching has always aimed and will always tend to guide, train, and direct the mind. The problem of reconstructing education so as to make it a releasing instead of a binding process has still to be solved. During the early phases of its struggle, therefore, the open conspiracy will be obliged to adopt a certain sectarianism of domestic and social life in the interest of its children, to experiment in novel educational methods and educational atmospheres, and it may even, in many cases, have to consider the groupings of its families in the establishment of its own schools. In many modern communities, the English-speaking states, for example, there is still liberty to establish educational companies running schools of special type. In every country where the right does not exist, it has to be fought for. There lies a great work for various groups of the open conspiracy. Successful schools would become laboratories of educational methods and patterns for new state schools. Necessarily for a time, but we may hope unconsciously, the open conspiracy children will become a social elite. From their first conscious moments, they will begin to think and talk among clear-headed people, speaking distinctly and behaving frankly, and it will be a waste and a loss to put them back for the scholastic stage among the mentally indistinct and morally muddled contemporaries. A phase when there will be a special educational system for the open conspiracy themes, therefore, to be indicated. Its children will learn to speak, draw, think, compute lucidly and subtly and into their vigorous minds. They will take the broad concepts of history, biology, and mechanical progress, the basis of the new world, naturally and easily. Meanwhile, those who grow up outside the advancing educational frontier of the open conspiracy will never come under the influence of its ideas, or they will get hold of them only after a severe struggle against a mass of misrepresentations and elaborately instilled prejudices. An adolescent and an adult educational campaign to undo the fixations and suggestions of the normal conservative and reactionary schools and colleges is and will remain an important part of the work of the open conspiracy. Always as long as I can remember, there have been dispute and invidious comparisons between the old and the young. The young find the old prey upon and restrain them, and the old find the young shallow, disappointing, and aimless in vivid contrast to their revised memories of their own early days. The present time is one in which these perennial accusations flower with exceptional vigor. But there does seem to be some truth in the statement that the faculties to live frivolously are growing greater now than they have ever been for old and young alike. For example, in the great modern communities that emerge now from Christendom, there is a widespread disposition to regard Sunday as merely a holiday. But that was certainly not the original intention of Sunday. As we have noticed already in an earlier chapter, it was a day dedicated to the greater issues of life. Now, greater multitudes of people do not even pretend to set aside any time at all to the greater issues of life. The greater issues are neglected altogether, the churches are neglected, and nothing of unifying or exalting sort takes their place. What the contemporary senior tells his junior today is perfectly correct. In his own youth, no serious impulse of his went to waste. He was not distracted by 1,000 gay but petty temptations, and the local religious powers, whatever they happened to be, seemed to believe in themselves more and made a more comprehensive attack upon his conscience and imagination. Now the old faiths are damaged and discredited, and the new and greater one, which is the open conspiracy, takes shape only gradually. A decade or so ago, socialism preached its confidence, hopes, and patriotism and imperial pride shared its attraction for the ever grave and passionate will of our emergent youth. Now socialism and democracy are under revision, and the flags that once waved so bravely reek of poison gas, are stiff with blood and mud and shameful with exposed dishonesties. Youth is what youth has always been, eager for fine interpretations of life, capable of splendid resolves. It has no natural disposition towards the shallow and confused life. It demands, as ever is, what am I told to do with myself? But it comes up out of its childhood today into a world of ruthless exposures and cynical pretensions. We are all a little ashamed of earnestness. The past 10 years have seen the shy and powerful idealism of youth at a loss and dismay and ashamed as perhaps it has never been before. It is in the world still, but masked, hiding even from itself in a whirl of small excitements and futile defiant depravities. The old flags and faiths have lost their magic for the intelligence of the young. they can command it no more. It is in the mighty revolution to which the open conspiracy directed itself that the youth of mankind must find its soul, if ever it is to find its soul again. All right, that's all we got for today. Hello, Corbin, Hashima Wan, Record Deepness. Record Deepness. So the open conspiracy has a failure point where the men with the gift of extracting money from private and public sources elect not to use that gift honestly and generously for those research inclined. Yep. Record Deepness. I don't know why the population of a high civilization would ever try to restrict its own increase. I'm sure Wells is worrying over nothing. Lol. All right, everyone. That's all for today. Make sure to tune in next week for part 6 of the Open Conspiracy. It's Todd Lewis of the Praise of Five podcast, signing off.